welcome. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Or, I might show up at your door. I'm just here to share some creepy stories, so sit back and enjoy. Disclaimer: the content presented in the video is purely for entertainment purposes only. The theories and stories discussed in this video are speculative and are not supported by any evidence or proof. Viewer discretion is advised. The vibration started at 0347 hours, a deep tremor that ran through the maintenance corridors like a dying heartbeat. I felt it first in the metal grating beneath my boots, then in the handrails as I made my routine rounds through Sector 7. 23 years maintaining this facility, and I'd never felt anything like it. A rhythmic pulse that seemed to come from the building's bones. I pulled out my diagnostic tablet, fingers moving automatically across the interface. The environmental control system showed green across all boards, everything normal according to the sensors. But the vibration pulsed again, stronger this time, and dust motes danced in the harsh emergency lighting overhead. The taste of metal filled my mouth, sharp and wrong. System diagnostic, full facility scan. I muttered into my comm unit, more habit than hope. The response crackled back immediately. All systems nominal, no alerts pending. The third pulse nearly knocked me off balance. I gripped the railing and felt it shudder under my hands. Metal doesn't lie, not like computer systems. Something was wrong, badly wrong, and I was the only one down here to notice it. I quickened my pace toward the central monitoring station, my footsteps echoing in the narrow corridor. The facility hummed around me with its usual mechanical breathing, air handlers cycling, pumps circulating coolant, the distant thrum of the main power grid. But underneath it all, that wrong vibration continued, building to a rhythm that made my teeth ache. The monitoring station sat in the heart of Sector 7, a cramped room lined with screens showing every system in the complex. I'd spent half my life in this chair, watching the green lights that meant everything was working as designed. Tonight, they all showed green, but my hands were shaking as I pulled up the structural monitoring subsystem. Pressure differentials across the facility showed normal. Airflow rates normal. Temperature gradients within acceptable parameters. I stared at the numbers, knowing they were wrong. The building was trying to tell me something through those deep vibrations, and the computers weren't listening. I pulled up the historical data, scrolling back through the last 72 hours. Nothing unusual in the logs. No maintenance scheduled in the abandoned wing, no authorized work that would explain the tremors. But as I dug deeper into the power consumption records, I found something that made my stomach clench. Small but consistent energy draws from the northwest wing over the past 6 months. Someone had been using power in an area that should have been completely dead. The screen went white. Emergency klaxons shrieked through the facility as every monitor in the station flashed red. I lunged for the master console as alerts flooded the system faster than I could read them. Structural integrity breach, ventilation system failure, atmospheric pressure loss. The main display showed a schematic of the facility with a spreading red zone in the northwest quadrant. The unused wing we'd sealed off 5 years ago after the budget cuts. According to the sensors, 3 major ventilation shafts had collapsed simultaneously, and the cascade was spreading toward the main facility. I hit the facility-wide intercom. "This is Maddox in Maintenance Central. We have a structural emergency in the northwest wing. All personnel evacuate sectors 12 through 18 immediately. Repeat, immediate evacuation of sectors 12 through 18. My hands flew across the controls, trying to isolate the damaged sections and reroute airflow through the backup systems. But the computer kept flashing the same message. Atmospheric control offline in affected areas. The door burst open behind me. "Maddox!" Priya rushed in, her safety coordinator badge swinging as she grabbed my shoulder. Her normally precise appearance was disheveled, blonde hair escaping from its ponytail, her emergency response manual clutched in one hand. "What's happening?" The atmospheric monitoring systems in my office went critical. CO2 levels are spiking in multiple sectors. Vent shafts collapsed in the northwest wing, I said, not looking up from the controls. Major ones. The whole atmospheric system is compromised. She leaned over my shoulder, reading the displays with practiced efficiency. Her fingers traced the red zones spreading across the schematic. This says we've got 14 people working late shifts in those sectors. Emergency protocols should have deployed the rescue drones automatically. Where are they? I pulled up the drone deployment system and my blood went cold. Every indicator showed red, not just offline, but actively locked out. Systems not responding. Look at this. I highlighted the error messages cascading down the screen. The rescue drones aren't just offline. Someone's used administrative override codes to disable the entire emergency response network. Priya's face went pale in the emergency lighting, her environmental specialist training making her understand the implications immediately. That's impossible. The emergency protocols are hardwired with triple redundancy. You'd need physical access to multiple systems and clearance higher than mine, I finished grimly. I tried my supervisor codes again. Access denied flashed back mockingly. Someone with facility-wide administrative access has crippled our rescue capability. The facility shuttered again, and I watched new red zones spread across the schematic like spilled blood. More ventilation shafts failing, the collapse spreading through the interconnected system like a disease. We need to get down there, I said, pushing back from the console. Manual rescue. There are people trapped, and if the atmospheric system keeps failing, they'll suffocate before anyone from outside can reach them. Priya was already on her radio. Orion, Nix, emergency response to maintenance central, immediately. We have a code black structural failure. I grabbed my emergency kit from the locker, respirator, portable atmospheric scanner, emergency lights, structural integrity detector. The tools I'd trained with but prayed I'd never need for real. As I checked the battery levels, a cold certainty settled in my chest. I'd done the final structural inspection of the northwest wing myself, just before they sealed it 5 years ago. The ventilation shafts had been properly reinforced, the concrete solid, the steel supports rated for twice the load they carried. There was no reason for simultaneous failure unless someone had weakened them deliberately. Priya, I said quietly, dreading the answer I suspected I'd get. Those power consumption readings I found, when did they start? She was already checking her tablet, scrolling through environmental logs with the kind of focused intensity that had made her the best safety coordinator we'd ever had. The pattern starts about 8 months ago. Small but regular draws, always during night shifts when minimal staff was present. And look at this. She showed me her screen. Atmospheric anomalies in that sector. Trace chemicals that shouldn't exist in a sealed, empty wing. The door opened again, and Orion strode in with Nix close behind. Orion's security uniform showed the signs of someone who'd been sleeping in his office again. Wrinkled shirt, loosened tie, but his gray eyes were sharp and focused, already assessing the situation. Nix looked like she'd sprinted from the drone maintenance bay, her technical toolkit still hanging from her belt, her dark hair pulled back in the severe ponytail she wore when working on complex problems. "What's our situation?" Orion asked, his voice carrying the authority that made everyone in the facility feel safer. I gestured at the displays. Major structural collapse in the northwest wing, atmospheric systems failing, 14 people trapped, and someone has deliberately disabled our rescue systems. Nix moved to the drone control console, her fingers dancing across the interface with the kind of speed that came from years of troubleshooting complex systems. Her expression grew darker with each screen she accessed. "This is sophisticated work," she said after a tense minute. "Whoever did this understood our emergency protocols intimately. They've created cascading lockouts that prevent any automated rescue deployment, and they've done it from multiple access points to make it look like system failures rather than sabotage." "Can you bypass it?" Priya asked, her safety coordinator instincts focused on the immediate crisis. "Not remotely. They've corrupted the software at the firmware level. Nix's jaw tightened. I'd need direct physical access to the drone bay's primary control systems to manually reset everything. But that's in Sector 15, right in the middle of the collapse zone. Orion studied the facility schematic with the tactical mindset that had made him invaluable during his 15 years managing facility security. 14 people trapped. How long before atmospheric conditions become critical? Priya consulted her readings, her environmental expertise cutting through the chaos. With the main ventilation system down and no air recycling in the affected sectors, they're breathing a closed system. CO2 buildup will start affecting cognitive function in 4 hours. Full respiratory failure in 6 to 8 hours, depending on their activity level and how well they conserve oxygen. Time for external rescue? Orion asked, though I could see he already knew the answer would be bad. I checked the facility's emergency beacon status on my console. Automated distress signal transmitted, but we're 60 miles from the nearest emergency response station. Even with helicopter deployment and specialized cave-in equipment, minimum 12 hours. The numbers were merciless. 6 hours until our trapped colleagues started dying. 12 hours until help arrived. And our only rescue capability had been systematically destroyed by someone who knew exactly how to cripple us. There's something else, I said, the pieces of a horrible puzzle clicking together in my mind. The Northwest Wing wasn't sealed just for budget cuts. I was part of the team that did the final environmental assessment before closure. We found discrepancies, contamination readings that didn't match the official reports, storage areas that weren't on any blueprints, chemical signatures that someone tried very hard to cover up. Orion's eyes sharpened with the intensity that made people confess things they never meant to reveal. What kind of chemical signatures? Industrial solvents, heavy metals, things that suggested illegal disposal operations. The kind of violations that would shut down the entire facility and put people in federal prison. I met his gaze, voicing the suspicion that had been growing since I saw those power consumption records. If someone was using the abandoned wing for unauthorized waste storage, and if they discovered we were about to investigate again, the implications settled over us like a toxic cloud. Someone had turned our own facility into a weapon to protect their crimes, and 14 innocent people were paying the price. We move now, Orion said, his voice carrying the authority that had kept this facility secure through budget cuts, personnel changes, and corporate reorganizations. Before whoever did this realizes we're organizing a response. I looked at the spreading red zones on the schematic, like a cancer consuming the facility's blueprint. 14 blinking indicators marked trapped personnel whose names I knew, whose families I'd met at company picnics. The error messages mocked me from every screen, reminding me that someone had turned my own systems against the people I was supposed to protect. 23 years I'd maintained this facility, kept it running through equipment failures and budget crises, took pride in the fact that my systems never failed when people needed them most. Now someone had perverted that trust, used my own knowledge of the building's vulnerabilities to create this nightmare. But those 14 people trapped in sectors 12 through 18 didn't know about the sabotage, didn't know their rescue systems had been crippled, didn't know they were breathing limited air while whoever destroyed their lifelines walked free. They were counting on us whether they realized it or not. Let's go save who we can, I said, tasting metal and determination in equal measure, and hoped my 23 years of experience would be enough to outwit whoever had turned my home into a tomb. The collapse spread like cancer through the building skeleton. I felt each new structural failure as a tremor in the floor, a groan in the walls that spoke of systems dying in cascade. We'd made it 3 levels down from Maintenance Central when the lights flickered and the first backup ventilation shaft gave way with a sound like breaking bones. Secondary collapse in Sector 11, Priya announced, reading from her atmospheric scanner as we moved through the maintenance tunnels. Her voice stayed professionally calm, but I could see the tension in how she gripped the device. That's the main trunk line for atmospheric processing. We're looking at total system failure within 2 hours. The tunnel stretched ahead of us, emergency lighting casting harsh shadows that made every pipe and conduit look like a threat. I'd walked these passages thousands of times, but tonight they felt alien. the familiar hum of ventilation fans replaced by ominous silence, the steady pressure of circulated air gone stagnant. "How many trapped now?" Orion asked, his tactical flashlight sweeping the corridor ahead. He moved with the controlled efficiency of someone who'd done emergency response before, but I could see his jaw tightening as he processed the implications. Nix consulted her tablet, pulling data from the facility's personnel tracking system. 18 confirmed in the affected zones. 4 additional people were scheduled for late shifts, but I can't get verification on their locations. The ID scanners went down with the rest of the emergency systems. She paused, her technical mind working through the cascade of failures. "Maddox, the pattern of these collapses isn't random. Someone engineered this to create maximum disruption with minimal structural damage to the main facility." I stopped walking, something cold settling in my stomach. "Show me." She held up her tablet, displaying a 3-dimensional model of the facility with the collapse zones highlighted in red. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable once you knew what to look for. Precise failures that severed the northwest wing from the main building while leaving the primary support structure intact. "They're not trying to bring down the whole facility," I said, understanding flooding through me like ice water. "They're trying to seal off the northwest wing permanently. Make it look like a structural failure so no one will ever dig deeper." Priya's atmospheric scanner began beeping with increasing urgency. CO2 levels are spiking throughout the main facility. Without the northwest wing's ventilation contribution, we're looking at degraded air quality facility-wide within 6 hours. She looked up from the device, her environmental expertise painting a grim picture. "Even if we save everyone in the collapse zones, we might all suffocate together." The tunnel ahead of us split into 2 branches, one leading to the emergency equipment caches, the other toward the manual ventilation controls that could potentially restore partial atmospheric processing. But as we approached the junction, I heard something that made me stop dead. The scrape of metal on concrete, coming from the direction of the equipment cache. I held up a hand, motioning for silence. We listened, for people breathing carefully in the stagnant air, and heard it again, deliberate movement where no one should be. "Someone's there," Orion whispered, his security training taking over. "Question is whether they're trapped personnel who found shelter or the people who caused this," I finished grimly. The cold certainty was growing stronger. We weren't just dealing with a structural collapse. We were walking into an active sabotage operation. Nix was already pulling up building schematics on her tablet, her technical mind finding solutions. "There's a service access that loops around behind the equipment cache. If we approach from the east tunnel, we can observe without being seen." We changed course, moving through passages I'd forgotten existed during decades of maintenance work. The facility revealed new secrets in the emergency lighting, access panels I'd never noticed, conduits that didn't match the official blueprints, evidence of modifications made without proper documentation. As we crept closer to the equipment cache, I could hear voices through the thin walls. 2 people, maybe 3, speaking in the low, urgent tones of people working against time. I pressed my ear to the ventilation grate and caught fragments of conversation that made my blood run cold. "Sealed the main access points. How long until the atmospheric system? Can't let them reach the storage areas." Priya leaned close to my ear, her whisper barely audible. "They're not trapped personnel. They're talking about sealing access points." Through the grate, I could see figures moving between the emergency equipment racks. 2 people in facility maintenance coveralls, their faces obscured by respirators. But I recognized the build and movement of one figure. Jake Morrison, senior maintenance technician, someone I'd worked with for 8 years. Someone with the access codes and system knowledge to cripple our emergency response. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Jake had been in my office just last week, complaining about budget cuts, sharing coffee and concerns about facility safety. Now he was systematically dismantling the equipment caches that trapped personnel might need to survive. "They're destroying the emergency supplies," I whispered to the others. "Respirators, emergency rations, atmospheric scrubbers, everything people would need to survive extended isolation." Orion's expression turned grim in the emergency lighting. His security background was showing him tactical implications I was only beginning to grasp. This isn't just about covering up illegal dumping. This is about eliminating witnesses. Anyone who might have seen unauthorized activity in the Northwest Wing over the past months. As if to confirm his assessment, one of the figures spoke louder, voice carrying through the thin walls. Make sure you get the atmospheric monitoring equipment. Can't have anyone tracking the contamination levels after this is over. The pieces clicked together with horrible clarity. The illegal dumping in the Northwest Wing. The systematic sabotage of emergency systems. The precise structural collapse designed to seal off evidence. And now the elimination of survival equipment to ensure no witnesses survive to tell what they'd seen. We need to stop them, Priya said, her safety coordinator instincts overriding her usual caution. Every piece of equipment they destroy reduces survival chances for the trapped personnel. But even as she spoke, we heard new sounds through the walls. The systematic destruction of life support equipment, the crash of emergency oxygen tanks being punctured, the grinding of electronic components being crushed. Jake and his accomplices were working with the efficiency of people following a pre-planned protocol. Nix was studying her tablet with increasing alarm. The facility's communication systems are being selectively targeted. External radio antennas, landline connections, even the emergency beacon. Someone's cutting us off from outside contact with surgical precision. I felt the walls of our situation closing in. Trapped personnel breathing stagnant air. Emergency systems sabotaged. Communication with outside help severed. And somewhere in the facility, people I trusted were working to ensure maximum casualties to protect their crimes. How long until the main atmospheric system fails completely? I asked Priya, dreading the answer. She checked her readings, environmental expertise cutting through my denial. Total failure in 90 minutes, maybe less. After that, CO2 buildup becomes critical throughout the facility. We'll all be breathing poison. The sound of destruction continued through the walls. More emergency equipment being systematically eliminated. More survival options disappearing with each crash and grind of metal. Jake's voice carried occasional instructions to his accomplice, coordinating their sabotage with the same methodical approach he'd always brought to maintenance work. There's got to be another equipment cache, I said, pulling up facility schematics on my mental map. Emergency protocols require redundant supply storage. If they're destroying this one, there should be a backup location they might not know about. Orion nodded, his security clearance giving him access to information I'd never seen. Sublevel storage. Below the original foundation. It's not on the standard maintenance maps because it was added during the facility expansion 12 years ago. Can we reach it without going through the collapse zones? Nix asked, her technical mind already plotting routes through the building's maze of passages. I traced the route in my memory, service tunnels, maintenance shafts, areas I'd crawled through during system installations and emergency repairs. Yes, but we'll have to go through the old steam distribution tunnels. They haven't been used for ventilation in years, so the air will be stagnant, probably toxic from old pipe sealants. Better than suffocating here, Priya said grimly, already checking her emergency respirator. As we prepared to leave, the destruction sounds through the wall suddenly stopped. Jake's voice came clearly through the silence. That's the last of it. Emergency supplies in this sector are neutralized. How are the communication systems? An unfamiliar voice replied, all external connections severed. Even if anyone survives the atmospheric failure, they won't be calling for help. The casual way they discussed mass murder made my hands shake with rage. These were people who'd sat in safety meetings, who'd trained in emergency response, who'd sworn to protect facility personnel. Now they were orchestrating a massacre to hide their crimes. They're moving, Orion whispered, gesturing toward sounds of footsteps moving away from the equipment cache. Now or never, we slipped deeper into the facility's hidden arteries, following passages that existed in the building's memory, but not its conscious blueprints. Behind us, the sounds of systematic destruction continued, not just equipment now, but structural elements being deliberately weakened to ensure the collapse spread according to plan. The steam tunnels were worse than I'd remembered. Air thick with decades of chemical residue, walls slick with condensation that might have been water or might have been industrial runoff. My respirator filtered the worst of it, but I could taste metal and decay with every breath. Atmospheric readings are getting worse, Priya reported as we crawled through a particularly narrow section. Whatever they stored in the northwest wing, it's contaminating the air supply faster than the computer models predicted. My tablet showed power consumption readings that told their own story. Massive energy draws from unauthorized equipment over the past 6 months. Patterns consistent with illegal waste processing operations. Someone had been using the abandoned wing as a private disposal facility, probably charging other companies premium rates to dump materials too dangerous for legitimate facilities. There, Nick said, pointing ahead to where emergency lighting outlined a maintenance access panel. Sublevel storage should be through that bulkhead. But as I reached for the access wheel, my worst fears were confirmed. The wheel spun freely, threads stripped, locking mechanism destroyed. Someone with intimate facility knowledge had been here first, sabotaging even the backup emergency supplies we weren't supposed to know existed. They thought of everything, I said, staring at the useless access panel. Whoever planned this operation knew every emergency protocol, every backup system, every survival option we might try to use. The implications were staggering. This wasn't opportunistic sabotage or panic-driven cover-up. This was a systematic elimination operation planned by someone with complete facility access and detailed knowledge of our emergency procedures. "We need to get to the trapped personnel," Orion said, his security training cutting through our despair. "Whatever supplies they destroyed, however they've sabotaged our systems, 18 people are breathing limited air and trusting us to find a way to save them." As we retraced our path through the steam tunnels, the facility continued its death symphony around us. Metal groaning as structural supports failed. Electronics sparking as systems overloaded. The whistle of air escaping through gaps that should have been sealed. But underneath it all, I could hear something else. The sound of voices calling for help, echoing through ventilation shafts and maintenance passages. 18 people who didn't know about the sabotage, who thought their emergency systems were simply malfunctioning, who believed rescue was coming. They were counting on us to find them before the air ran out, before the saboteurs completed their work, before the facility became a tomb designed to hide crimes that someone was willing to commit mass murder to protect. I thought about Jake Morrison sharing coffee in my office, talking about facility safety while planning to murder his colleagues. I thought about the systematic destruction of equipment that could save lives, the precise engineering of structural collapse, the casual discussion of eliminating witnesses. 23 years maintaining this facility, and I'd never imagined someone would turn it into a weapon against the people who worked here. But as we crawled through tunnels thick with toxic air, racing against time and saboteurs and the building's own dying systems, I made a promise to those 18 voices calling for help. Whatever it cost, whoever had betrayed us, however many systems they destroyed, we were going to find a way to save who we could. Even if it meant facing the people who'd turned our workplace into a killing ground. The discovery came in the worst possible place, crawling through a ventilation shaft barely wide enough for my shoulders, following emergency lighting toward what we hoped was another route to the trapped personnel. I'd been maintaining this facility for 23 years, but I'd never seen the documents scattered across the maintenance junction ahead of us. Orion reached them first, his tactical flashlight revealing shipping manifests, payment receipts, and disposal certificates that made my blood freeze. "Industrial solvents," he read aloud, his security training helping him parse the technical language. "Chromium compounds, benzene derivatives, heavy metal processing residue." He looked up from the papers, his expression grim. "This stuff shouldn't exist anywhere near a civilian facility." I grabbed one of the manifests, recognizing the facility stamp and Jake Morrison's signature at the bottom. 6 months of unauthorized waste deliveries, all routed through the northwest wing, all processed outside normal safety protocols. The payment amounts made me sick, hundreds of thousands of dollars for illegal disposal of materials that would have cost millions to handle properly. They weren't just dumping, I said, the pieces clicking together with horrible clarity. They were running a commercial operation, taking contracts from other companies, charging premium rates to dispose of materials too dangerous for legitimate facilities. Nix was studying her tablet, cross-referencing the manifest chemicals with atmospheric contamination data. These compounds would explain the accelerated air quality degradation. Some of these chemicals react with standard building materials, concrete, metal, insulation. They turn the entire northwest wing into a toxic gas generator. Priya's atmospheric scanner was beeping with increasing urgency as she processed the implications. If these chemicals are dispersing through the ventilation system, we're not just dealing with suffocation. We're looking at active poisoning of everyone in the facility. I found myself staring at Jake's signature on manifest after manifest, each one representing a betrayal of every safety protocol we'd sworn to uphold. The man who'd complained about budget cuts had been making more in 6 months of illegal dumping than his annual salary. The colleague who'd shared my concerns about facility safety had been turning our workplace into a death trap. There's more, Orion said, holding up a different document. Communication logs showing coordination with outside parties. This wasn't just Jake and one accomplice. This was a network, people at other facilities, transport companies, maybe even regulatory officials who were supposed to be monitoring waste disposal. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Multiple facilities, multiple companies, a systematic network of illegal disposal operations that could have been running for years. And now, with an investigation threatened by the structural collapse, they were willing to commit mass murder to protect their crimes. Listen, Nix said suddenly, holding up her hand for silence. Through the ventilation shaft walls, I could hear voices. Not the distant calls for help from trapped personnel, but the close conversation of people moving through nearby passages. Jake's voice, familiar and horrifying in its casual tone, discussing our progress with someone else. Saw them heading toward the steam tunnels. They're trying to reach the sublevel storage. Doesn't matter, replied an unfamiliar voice, cold and professional. We already neutralized those supplies. Even if they find emergency equipment, they won't have time to distribute it before atmospheric failure. What about the personnel in Sector 11? Jake asked. 18 people is a lot of witnesses if they somehow survive. They won't survive. The chemical dispersal is accelerating faster than the computer models predicted. Even with emergency respirators, they're breathing concentrated toxins. A pause, then. The beauty of this approach is that it looks like industrial accident. Structural collapse caused chemical spill. Chemical spill caused atmospheric contamination. No one will look deeper once the death toll is high enough. I felt Priya's hand on my arm, her grip tight with shock. Through the thin metal walls, we were listening to people casually discussing the murder of our colleagues, planning their deaths as precisely as they'd planned the structural collapse. How long until the main facility reaches critical contamination? The unfamiliar voice asked. 2 hours, maybe less, Jake replied. Anyone still breathing facility air will be unconscious within 90 minutes, dead within 3 hours. The cleanup crew can come in tomorrow with full hazmat gear and recover the bodies. And the investigation? Industrial accident. Tragic structural failure in an aging facility, compounded by unknown chemical storage in an abandoned wing. The company will pay settlement money, implement new safety protocols, and everyone moves on. Jake's voice carried the satisfaction of someone who'd thought through every angle. No one will dig deeper once they see the body count. The casual calculation in his voice made me want to vomit. This wasn't panic-driven cover-up anymore. This was systematic elimination, planned with the same methodical approach Jake brought to maintenance schedules. The only difference was that instead of repairing systems, he was designing mass murder. They're moving, Orion whispered, gesturing toward the sound of footsteps moving away from our position. We waited in the cramped ventilation shaft until the voices faded, then continued toward our destination with new understanding of what we faced. Not just structural collapse and atmospheric failure, but active chemical warfare being waged by people who knew our every emergency protocol. The trapped personnel don't just need rescue, I said as we crawled through another junction. They need immediate decontamination. If they've been breathing concentrated chemical vapors for the past hour, they're already poisoned, Priya finished grimly. Even if we reach them, even if we can restore atmospheric circulation, they'll need medical treatment we can't provide. The facility's emergency medical supplies were stored in the same caches Jake had systematically destroyed. The external communication systems he'd severed would have been our way to call for hazmat response teams. Every option we might have used to save lives had been anticipated and eliminated. There has to be something they missed, Nick said, her technical mind refusing to accept complete defeat. Some backup system, some emergency protocol they didn't know about. I forced myself to think beyond the standard emergency procedures, reaching into memories of facility construction and modification over 2 decades. The original foundation included emergency air filtration for the main administrative areas. It was designed during the Cold War, built to maintain atmospheric integrity during chemical attacks. Does it still function? Orion asked. I don't know. It was sealed when the facility was converted to civilian use, but the hardware should still be there. If we can reach the basement-level control room and reactivate those systems, we could create a clean air zone, Priya said, understanding immediately. Small, limited capacity, but enough to keep critical personnel alive until outside help arrives. Assuming outside help would arrive. Assuming someone would eventually notice that an entire facility had gone silent. Assuming the cleanup crew Jake mentioned wouldn't simply dispose of our bodies along with the evidence of illegal dumping. We reached the access shaft that would take us toward the basement-level controls. But as I prepared to descend, Nix grabbed my arm. Movement sensor showing activity directly below us. Multiple personnel, moving with purpose. Through the shaft grating, I could see figures in full hazmat suits working in the basement control room. Not emergency responders, these people moved with the efficiency of individuals following a predetermined plan. They were already here, already working to ensure the building's emergency systems remained disabled. The cleanup crew, I said, watching them systematically disconnect emergency controls. They're not waiting for everyone to die. They're here now, making sure no one survives to complicate their story. One of the hazmat-suited figures looked up toward our shaft, and I caught a glimpse of face through the visor. A woman I didn't recognize, professional and cold, supervising the disconnection of systems with the same attention to detail someone might bring to facility maintenance. This is corporate, Orion said, his security background reading implications I was only beginning to understand. This level of planning, this kind of cleanup operation, this isn't local criminals covering their tracks. This is systematic elimination ordered from high enough up the chain to coordinate hazmat teams and cover up operations. The scope kept expanding. Not just Jake Morrison and a local conspirator. Not even just a network of illegal disposal operations. This was corporate murder, planned and executed by people with the resources to coordinate complex operations and the connections to ensure investigations would conclude what they wanted them to conclude. How many people are we really trying to save? Priya asked quietly. If this is corporate operation with hazmat teams and cleanup crews, if they're willing to commit mass murder to protect their crimes. 18 confirmed trapped in the collapse zones, I said, clinging to the concrete numbers. 4 additional personnel unaccounted for, plus the 4 of us. 26 people whose lives depend on finding something these bastards missed. Below us, the hazmat team continued their systematic destruction of emergency systems, each disconnected control reducing our options further. But as I watched them work, I noticed something they might not have considered. The emergency systems they were disabling were connected to automated safety protocols throughout the facility. If they disconnect the wrong combination of controls, I said slowly, they'll trigger the facility's automatic emergency lockdown. All blast doors will seal, all external access points will lock, all communication systems will switch to emergency-only mode. trapping them inside with us, Nix realized, and triggering automated distress signals that can't be disconnected from internal control rooms. Orion added, his security clearance giving him knowledge of systems I'd never seen. Those signals go directly to federal emergency management. Even corporate connections can't stop that kind of automatic alert. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was something. If we could force the hazmat team to trigger emergency lockdown, we'd buy time and ensure outside attention. The question was whether we could survive long enough for that help to arrive, and whether the 18 trapped personnel could survive the accelerating chemical contamination. As we prepared to move toward a different access route, I took one last look at the documents scattered around the ventilation junction. Manifests bearing Jake's signature. Payment records showing hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal profits. Chemical disposal certificates for materials that should never have existed near civilian personnel. The evidence was all here, proof of crimes that had turned our facility into a death trap. But evidence only mattered if someone survived to present it. And with each passing minute, with each system the hazmat team disabled, our chances of survival decreased. 26 people against corporate murder. 18 voices calling for help from contaminated zones. Emergency systems systematically destroyed by people who'd planned this operation with the same precision others might use to plan facility maintenance. But we had one advantage they hadn't considered. 23 years of maintaining this facility had taught me every passage, every system, every vulnerability in a building they only knew from blueprints. Time to find out if that knowledge was enough to save the people counting on us to find a way. The access shaft that would take us around the hazmat team's position had barely enough clearance for one person at a time. I lowered myself down the maintenance ladder, listening to their radio chatter echoing through the basement corridors. Their casual efficiency chilled me. These weren't panicked conspirators covering up Jake's crimes. They were professionals executing a predetermined plan. Control team, report status on atmospheric systems. Came a voice through their communications. All emergency ventilation disabled. Backup filtration offline. Estimated completion in 15 minutes. 15 minutes until every emergency system in the facility would be permanently severed. I signaled up to the others, then began moving through the narrow maintenance crawlway that would take us around the hazmat team's position. 23 years of maintaining these passages meant I knew routes that wouldn't appear on any blueprint they'd studied. The chemical contamination was worse down here. My throat burned with each breath, and the metallic taste that had been building over the past hour now felt like I was breathing liquid metal. Behind me, I could hear Priya's atmospheric scanner beeping with increasing urgency. We were approaching levels that would cause permanent organ damage. Maddox! Nix's voice was tight with strain as she crawled behind me. Drone diagnostics are showing complete system failure in sectors 9 through 13. The chemical reactions are corroding electronic components faster than the computer models predicted. That meant the 18 trapped personnel weren't just dealing with suffocation anymore. They were breathing air so contaminated that the emergency respirators we distributed earlier would provide minimal protection. Every minute we delayed meant more irreversible poisoning for people who'd followed our evacuation instructions. I reached the junction point where the maintenance crawlway connected to the main basement corridor. Through the metal grating, I could see 3 hazmat-suited figures working at the emergency control panel, systematically disconnecting systems with the methodical approach of people following a detailed checklist. Final disconnection sequence initiated. One of them reported into their radio. All personnel should be clear of the facility within 2 hours. 2 hours. That was how long they expected it to take for everyone still breathing facility air to die. I watched them work, noting which systems they were targeting: emergency ventilation, backup power, external communication arrays, and the automated distress beacon that would normally alert federal authorities to catastrophic facility failure. But as I studied their work, I noticed something that made my breath catch. They were following a standard protocol for chemical containment in government facilities, but this wasn't a government facility anymore. The conversion to civilian use had included modifications they didn't know about, modifications I'd personally supervised 15 years ago. The emergency lockdown system, I whispered into my radio. They don't know about the civilian safety modifications. The original Cold War-era emergency protocols had been designed for facilities with military personnel who could survive harsh conditions. When the facility was converted for civilian use, additional safety systems had been installed. Systems that would automatically activate if too many emergency controls were disconnected simultaneously. What kind of modifications? Orion's voice came through my earpiece. Automatic external alert if more than 60% of emergency systems go offline within a 30-minute window. Blast door lockdown to prevent contamination spread. Emergency power isolation to prevent electrical fires during chemical events. I could see the hazmat team was already past the 50% threshold. 3 more disconnections would trigger the automated lockdown sequence. A sequence that would trap them inside the facility with us while simultaneously broadcasting a federal emergency alert that couldn't be stopped from within the building. How long until they hit the trigger point? Priya asked. I watched their progress against the control panel layout. 2 minutes, maybe less. The question was whether triggering the lockdown would help us save the trapped personnel or simply ensure we all died together. The emergency systems they were disabling included the atmospheric processing equipment that was our only hope of providing clean air to the contaminated zones. Through the grating, I could hear one of the hazmat team members speaking into their radio. Sector 11 atmospheric readings show critical contamination levels. Personnel in that area will be unconscious within 30 minutes. 30 minutes. 18 people who'd trusted our facility's safety systems, who'd followed emergency protocols, who were now dying because those protocols had been sabotaged by people they'd worked alongside for years. I'm going to trigger the lockdown, I said into my radio. Maddox, no. Priya's voice was sharp with alarm. If we're sealed in here with this level of contamination, we're dead anyway if we can't restore atmospheric processing. But if the lockdown triggers, the emergency power systems will switch to backup mode. That might give us enough electrical capacity to restart some of the atmospheric controls manually. It wasn't much of a plan. The backup power system was designed for short-term emergency lighting, not full atmospheric processing. But it was the only option that didn't involve watching 18 people die while we waited for help that might never come. I moved through the crawlway toward the electrical junction that controlled the emergency disconnection monitoring system. The wiring was original installation, systems I'd maintained and modified over 2 decades. If I could create a false reading that showed all emergency systems had been disconnected simultaneously, the hazmat team's radio chatter was becoming more urgent as they realized they were running behind schedule. Control team expedite disconnection. Transport team reports Federal Aviation Authority inquiring about facility communication silence. Someone was already looking for us. Not the corporate cleanup operation, but legitimate authorities wondering why a major facility had gone completely silent during normal business hours. If I could trigger the federal emergency alert, if I could ensure outside attention focused on this facility, I reached the electrical junction and began working with tools that felt clumsy in my contaminated gloves. The chemical exposure was affecting my fine motor control, making it difficult to handle small components. But I could see which circuits controlled the emergency monitoring system, which connections would register massive system failure. Maddox, I'm showing movement in the main corridor, Nix reported through the radio. Multiple personnel heading toward your position. Through the junction grating, I could see hazmat-suited figures moving with new urgency. They detected our presence somehow, motion sensors, heat signatures, or simply the logical deduction that facility maintenance staff would try to access emergency controls. How long do you need? Orion asked. 30 seconds. I forced my shaking hands to steady as I worked with the monitoring circuits. The contamination was worse than I'd realized. My vision was starting to blur, and each breath felt like inhaling acid. But the connections were almost complete. Multiple contacts, Orion reported, his security training reading tactical implications. They're coordinating a sweep pattern, professional movement, military precision, not just corporate cleanup anymore. These were people with tactical training, moving to eliminate threats with the same systematic approach they'd brought to disabling emergency systems. I finished the final connection just as footsteps approached the maintenance access above my position. The emergency monitoring system registered total system failure and immediately triggered automated responses throughout the facility. Blast doors slammed shut with a sound like thunder, sealing all external access points. Emergency lighting switched to battery backup, casting everything in harsh red illumination. And most importantly, the federal emergency beacon activated, broadcasting a signal that couldn't be interrupted or overridden from within the facility. The hazmat team's radio chatter exploded into panic as they realized what had happened. Control team, we have facility lockdown. Repeat, facility lockdown triggered, external access sealed, emergency broadcast active. All personnel trapped inside facility. Through the junction grating, I could see the hazmat-suited figures trying frantically to override the lockdown systems. But the Cold War engineers who designed this facility had built the emergency protocols to resist exactly this kind of interference. Once triggered, the lockdown could only be reversed from outside the facility or after a minimum 6-hour automatic cycle. The good news, I reported through my radio, is that we just bought time and guaranteed outside attention. Federal emergency response will have helicopters here within an hour. The bad news, Priya asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. We're all breathing the same contaminated air now. The lockdown sealed the ventilation system, no fresh air coming in, no contaminated air going out. Whatever chemical exposure we face together. I began crawling back toward the others, but the contamination was affecting my coordination more severely. The maintenance crawlway seemed to stretch endlessly, and my arms felt too weak to support my weight. Behind me, I could hear the hazmat team organizing a systematic search of the basement level. Atmospheric readings are approaching lethal levels in all zones, Nix reported. The chemical reactions are accelerating in the sealed environment. Through my earpiece, I could hear faint voices from the trapped personnel in Sector 11. Weaker now, some unconscious, but still 18 people whose lives depended on our ability to restore atmospheric processing with emergency power that was never designed for this kind of load. I reached the junction where the others were waiting and realized that triggering the lockdown had created a new problem. The emergency power system was providing minimal electrical capacity, but the atmospheric processing equipment required massive power draw. We could restart maybe 30% of the air purification systems, enough to create small pockets of clean air, but not enough to save everyone. We have to choose, I said, the words tasting like poison. 18 trapped personnel, for missing personnel, for of us. 26 people total. The emergency power can support atmospheric processing for maybe 8 people maximum. The numbers were brutal and absolute. Even if federal response teams arrived within an hour, even if they could override the facility lockdown, most of us would be dead from chemical poisoning before they reached us. The emergency power gave us the ability to create survival zones for less than 1/3 of the people counting on us. The trapped personnel in Sector 11 are closest to the main atmospheric processing station, Priya said, her voice steady despite the implications. If we focus all emergency power there, we condemn everyone else, Orion finished, including the 4 missing personnel we haven't located yet. Through the facility's emergency communication system, I could hear Jake's voice coordinating with the hazmat team. Even trapped inside the lockdown with us, even facing the same chemical contamination, he was still working to ensure the cover-up succeeded. The illegal dumping operation had evolved from corporate crime into systematic elimination. He'd rather see all of us die than face prosecution for environmental murder. There's something else, Nick said, studying her tablet's diagnostic readings. The chemical reactions are generating hydrogen gas as a byproduct. If the concentration builds up in the sealed facility, she didn't need to finish. Hydrogen gas plus emergency electrical systems equaled explosion risk that could kill everyone instantly. The lockdown that was supposed to save us by attracting federal attention might instead turn the entire facility into a bomb. I looked at my watch and realized we'd been dealing with this crisis for over 2 hours. 2 hours since the first vent shaft collapsed in what we now knew was a deliberate trigger event. 2 hours since 18 people had been trapped in the northwest wing where illegal chemical storage had turned emergency shelter areas into contamination zones. 2 hours since Jake Morrison had activated a corporate murder operation designed to eliminate witnesses to environmental crimes. The atmospheric processing controls are one level down, I said, forcing myself to focus on immediate action. If we can restart even partial systems, we can buy time for federal response. But as we prepared to move toward the processing controls, the facility's emergency lighting flickered and dimmed. The emergency power system was already being strained beyond capacity by the lockdown protocols. Adding atmospheric processing to the electrical load might cause complete power failure, leaving us trapped in darkness with contaminated air and no way to signal our location to rescue teams. 26 lives depending on decisions I wasn't qualified to make. Emergency systems pushed beyond their design limits. Corporate killers trapped in the same facility, working actively to ensure maximum casualties. And somewhere above us, 18 voices growing weaker as they called for help that might come too late. The weight of command had fallen on all of us, but the technical decisions were mine to make. 23 years of facility maintenance had prepared me to repair systems, not to choose who lived and who died when those systems were deliberately destroyed by people we trusted. But if I didn't choose, if I didn't act, everyone would die equally. And that wasn't salvation. That was just surrender to the people who turned our workplace into a killing ground. The numbers were absolute and merciless. Emergency power could support atmospheric processing for 8 people maximum. 26 people were counting on us. 18 trapped in Sector 11. For missing personnel we still hadn't located, and the 4 of us. The mathematics of survival had reduced human lives to electrical load calculations, and every choice meant condemning others to death by chemical poisoning. I studied the emergency power distribution panel through blurred vision, my contamination exposure making it difficult to focus on the technical readouts. The lockdown had given us federal attention and trapped our enemies with us, but it had also sealed us into a tomb with accelerating chemical reactions. The hydrogen gas buildup Nix had detected was approaching dangerous concentrations. One electrical spark could turn the entire facility into a crater. Maddox, we need decisions now. Orion's voice carried the weight of command authority, but I could hear the strain. 23 years of facility management hadn't prepared any of us for choosing who deserved to live. Through the facility's damaged communication system, I could still hear voices from Sector 11, weaker now, some unconscious, but still 18 people who'd followed emergency protocols and ended up in contamination zones because those protocols had been sabotaged. Their atmospheric readings showed they had maybe 20 minutes of consciousness left, 30 minutes maximum before irreversible organ damage. The missing personnel, I said, forcing myself to think tactically rather than emotionally. Where were they when the first collapse happened? Nix consulted her tablet, though her hands were shaking from chemical exposure. 2 were in the administrative wing, 2 in the loading dock area. Both zones show massive contamination from the illegal storage areas. That gave us proximity information. The Sector 11 personnel were closest to the main atmospheric processing station. If we focused all emergency power there, we could create a survival zone for 18 people. The missing 4 were scattered in areas where portable atmospheric equipment might reach them, or they might already be dead from contamination exposure in the zones where the illegal dumping had been most concentrated. There's another factor, Priya said, her safety coordinator training cutting through the emotional weight. The federal response team will enter through the main facility entrance. If we position ourselves near the atmospheric processing station, we'll be in their direct path. Maximum chance of rescue for whoever survives until they arrive. The implication was clear. Abandon the missing 4, focus on the trapped 18, position ourselves for rescue. Save 22 people and condemn 4. The mathematics of emergency response made brutal sense, but it felt like signing death warrants for people whose only crime was being in the wrong location when corporate murderers triggered their cover-up. Through the facility's damaged communication system, I could hear the hazmat team's coordination chatter echoing through the basement. Control team, hydrogen concentration approaching ignition threshold. Any electrical activation could trigger explosion. They knew about the hydrogen buildup. They knew we were trying to restart atmospheric processing. And they were preparing to turn our life-saving efforts into a facility-wide explosion that would eliminate all witnesses while appearing to be an accidental chemical disaster. If we activate atmospheric processing, they'll trigger an electrical surge to ignite the hydrogen, I realized. They're waiting for us to provide the spark for their final solution. Orion's security training was already analyzing tactical implications. They need the electrical load from atmospheric processing to mask their intentional surge. Without that power draw, any explosion would clearly show as sabotage in the investigation. We were trapped in their plan. Save the 18 trapped personnel and provide cover for mass murder by explosion. Let everyone die from contamination and deny them their cover story, but fail in our most basic duty to the people counting on us for survival. There's a third option, Nick said, studying the facility's electrical schematics on her tablet. The emergency power system has manual isolation switches. I can separate the atmospheric processing circuits from the main electrical grid. They can't trigger a surge through isolated circuits. Where are the isolation switches? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Basement level, section C. Right through the area where the hazmat team is positioned. Of course. The switches that could save everyone were located exactly where armed corporate killers were waiting to eliminate any threats to their operation. Reaching those switches would require passing through contaminated areas where the chemical exposure would cause unconsciousness within minutes. Then confronting trained professionals who'd already demonstrated they were willing to commit mass murder. I'll go, I said, the words coming out before I'd consciously made the decision. I know the electrical systems better than anyone. I can isolate the circuits and restart atmospheric processing without giving them an ignition source. Maddox, the contamination levels in that section. Priya started, but I cut her off. Will kill me, yes, but the isolation switches have manual override capability. Even if I'm unconscious when I reach them, I can trigger the isolation sequence. The atmospheric processing will restart automatically once the circuits are separated. It wasn't heroic, it was just technical reality. Someone had to reach those switches, and I was the only one who knew exactly which circuits needed isolation. The contamination would likely kill me before I could return, but the 18 trapped personnel would have clean air, the missing 4 would have a chance at rescue, and the explosion threat would be eliminated. There's something else, I continued, studying the facility schematics. The manual isolation sequence will trigger emergency evacuation protocols that override the lockdown system. Federal response teams will have access within minutes instead of hours. Through the emergency communication system, I could hear the trapped personnel's voices growing weaker. People I'd worked with for years, people whose families I knew, people whose children had played in the facility's parking lot during weekend maintenance calls. The mathematics of emergency response said 18 lives outweighed 1, but the emotional reality was that these were my people, and I'd failed to protect them from dangers I should have detected earlier. The hazmat team will try to stop you, Orion pointed out, his tactical analysis cutting through emotional considerations. They'll try, but they need to keep me alive long enough to trigger the atmospheric processing, or they lose their cover story. They can't just shoot me. They need the appearance of accidental death during emergency response. It was a thin advantage, but it was something. They needed my technical knowledge to complete their plan, which meant they'd try to manipulate me into providing the electrical load they required for ignition rather than simply killing me outright. I began checking my emergency equipment, though the contamination had already affected my fine motor control. The portable atmospheric scanner, emergency radio, electrical testing equipment, tools that felt foreign in my shaking hands but represented the difference between successful isolation and catastrophic failure. How long until the federal response team arrives? I asked. Nix checked the emergency beacon status on her tablet. Automatic distress signal has been broadcasting for 12 minutes. Standard response time for chemical emergency is 35 to 45 minutes for helicopter deployment. 23 minutes. I needed to reach the isolation switches, separate the electrical circuits, restart atmospheric processing, and survive long enough for the evacuation override to take effect. All while breathing air so contaminated that each step toward the basement level would cause further organ damage. The portable respirator will give you maybe 10 minutes of filtered air, Priya said, helping me adjust the emergency breathing apparatus. After that, you'll be on contaminated atmosphere like everyone else. 10 minutes to cover 3 levels of damaged facility, bypass a team of armed professionals, locate specific electrical switches in a basement level I hadn't accessed in months, and complete manual isolation procedures that normally required careful testing and verification. The timeline was impossible, but it was the only timeline that offered any chance of survival for the people counting on us. I looked at Orion, Priya, and Nix, 3 people whose skills and knowledge had carried us through 2 hours of systematic betrayal and corporate murder. If the isolation procedure worked, if atmospheric processing restarted successfully, they'd be responsible for coordinating rescue efforts for whoever survived until federal response arrived. The Sector 11 personnel will need medical attention immediately once clean air is restored, I told them. Severe chemical exposure, possible organ damage. The federal response team will have medical capabilities, but you'll need to provide specific contamination information. Understood, Priya said, her safety coordinator training taking over. What about the missing 4 personnel? Once atmospheric processing is running, use the portable equipment to create clean air pockets. Search patterns starting with the administrative wing, it's closer to fresh air supplies. If they're alive, they'll need immediate evacuation. Through the facility's damaged communication system, I could hear the hazmat team coordinating final preparations. Target is moving toward basement level. Maintain positions but allow approach to electrical systems. Activation sequence must appear voluntary. They were ready for me. They knew I was coming. They knew what I was trying to accomplish, and they had a plan to turn my life-saving efforts into the final act of their cover-up. But they still needed me to actually reach those switches and trigger the electrical load that would provide cover for their explosion. I started moving toward the basement level, each step taking me deeper into contaminated atmosphere. The portable respirator provided clean air, but I could feel the chemical exposure through my skin, a burning sensation that grew stronger as I approached the areas where illegal dumping had created the highest toxin concentrations. The facility's emergency lighting cast everything in harsh red shadows, turning familiar corridors into alien landscapes. 23 years of maintenance work had made these passages feel like home, but now they felt like a maze designed to trap and kill anyone who entered. The lockdown had eliminated external ventilation, creating a sealed environment where chemical reactions accelerated and hydrogen gas built toward explosive concentrations. I reached the first basement level and could hear the hazmat team's radio communications clearly now. Professional voices coordinating positions, monitoring my approach, discussing timing for their final operation. They weren't panicked conspirators anymore. They were tactical professionals executing a complex plan that required my cooperation to succeed. Control team, target approaching Section B. Atmospheric readings show critical exposure levels. Estimate 8 to 10 minutes until unconsciousness. 8 minutes. The same amount of time the portable respirator would provide clean air. They'd calculated the contamination exposure precisely, planning for me to reach the electrical switches with just enough consciousness remaining to activate the systems they needed for their explosion. But they didn't know about the manual isolation capability. They didn't know that the switches could be operated even after unconsciousness, that the emergency procedures were designed for exactly this kind of crisis situation. Their plan required electrical surge ignition, but isolated circuits couldn't provide the power feedback they needed. I continued towards Section C, breathing filtered air while chemical toxins soaked through my clothing and skin. Behind me, I could hear Orion, Priya, and Nix coordinating their own preparations, positioning themselves near the atmospheric processing station, preparing medical supplies for contamination treatment, organizing rescue priorities for when federal response teams arrived. If the isolation procedure worked, if atmospheric processing restarted, if I could complete the manual override before the contamination killed me. If not, 26 people would die from corporate murder disguised as industrial accident, and the illegal dumping operation that had poisoned our workplace would remain hidden forever. 7 minutes of clean air remaining. 3 basement levels to go. And somewhere in the contaminated darkness ahead, professional killers waiting to turn my final act into their perfect crime. The basement air burned my lungs despite the respirator's best efforts. Chemical contamination had reached levels where personal protective equipment could only delay the inevitable, not prevent it. Each breath felt like swallowing acid, and my vision kept blurring as toxins absorbed through my skin attacked my nervous system. I'd reached Section C, where the manual isolation switches waited behind a maintenance panel I'd serviced hundreds of times during normal operations. But nothing about this facility felt normal anymore. The emergency lighting cast red shadows that made familiar equipment look alien, and the silence felt wrong. 23 years of maintenance work had taught me the building's rhythm, its mechanical heartbeat of ventilation and electrical systems. Now that heartbeat was irregular, dying. Through my earpiece, I could hear the hazmat team's final preparations. Jake's voice coordinated positions with professional calm. Target approaching isolation switches. Remember, full electrical activation required before ignition sequence. Let him complete the startup. They still believed I was going to restart atmospheric processing normally, providing them the electrical load signature they needed to disguise their explosion as accidental. They'd positioned themselves to allow my approach, counting on contamination exposure to limit my ability to think clearly or deviate from standard emergency procedures. But the manual isolation switches weren't part of standard procedures. They were emergency-only equipment, installed after a power surge incident 5 years ago had damaged critical ventilation systems. Most facility personnel didn't even know they existed, hidden behind a maintenance panel that looked identical to dozens of others throughout the building. I opened the panel with hands that shook from chemical exposure. The isolation switches were clearly labeled, 6 circuits that controlled atmospheric processing, emergency ventilation, and backup power distribution. Separating these circuits from the main electrical grid would prevent any surge from reaching the life support systems, but it would also mean running on battery power with maybe 90 minutes of capacity. 90 minutes for federal response teams to reach us. 90 minutes for the trapped personnel in Sector 11 to survive on emergency atmosphere. 90 minutes to extract whoever might still be alive in the contaminated zones where our missing colleagues had disappeared. The portable respirator was giving me maybe 3 minutes of clean air remaining. After that, I'd be breathing the same contaminated atmosphere that was slowly killing everyone else in the facility. The chemical exposure would cause unconsciousness within minutes, irreversible organ damage shortly after. But the isolation switches had been designed for crisis operation. Heavy-duty toggles that could be activated even with severely impaired motor control. Emergency procedures that would trigger automatically once the isolation sequence began. I started with the main atmospheric processing circuit. The switch required significant force to overcome safety interlocks, but years of maintenance work had built the muscle memory. Even with shaking hands and blurred vision, I could feel the electrical connection separate as the toggle moved to isolated position. The facility's electrical hum changed immediately. Emergency power systems began automatically redistributing load as the atmospheric processing circuits separated from the main grid. I could hear Jake's voice through the earpiece. Confused. Control team. Electrical signature is changing. Power draw isn't matching expected parameters. They realized something was wrong, but they didn't understand what I'd done. Atmospheric processing was coming online, but on isolated circuits that couldn't provide feedback to the main electrical grid. Their explosion plan required power surge ignition, but isolated systems couldn't generate the electrical feedback they needed. I continued down the row of isolation switches. Emergency ventilation, isolated. Backup power distribution, isolated. Critical life support systems, isolated. Each switch separation reduced their ability to trigger a facility-wide explosion, but it also reduced our total power capacity. We were trading long-term electrical stability for immediate protection against sabotage. Through the facility's intercom system, I could hear Orion's voice coordinating with the teams above. Maddox has reached the electrical systems. Atmospheric readings are improving in Sector 11. 18 personnel showing signs of recovery. The isolation procedure was working. Clean air was reaching the trapped personnel, and the separation of electrical circuits had eliminated the explosion threat. But I could feel the contamination exposure affecting my consciousness. Thoughts becoming slower, vision darkening at the edges, fine motor control failing rapidly. The portable respirator's clean air supply ran out as I completed the final switch isolation. Suddenly, I was breathing the same contaminated atmosphere that had nearly killed everyone else, feeling chemical toxins flood my system with each desperate breath. The basement air tasted of metal and burning electronics, with an underlying chemical sweetness that meant serious toxin exposure. I could hear Jake's team realizing their plan had failed. Electrical systems are isolated. No surge capability. Repeat, no ignition possible through electrical systems. They'd lost their cover story. The facility explosion that would have eliminated all evidence and witnesses was no longer possible. The federal response team would find a contaminated facility with clear evidence of illegal dumping, deliberate sabotage, and attempted mass murder. But they still had conventional weapons, and I was alone in a basement level with no escape routes. My technical knowledge had completed the mission, but it had also made me a direct threat to their operation. If they couldn't disguise their crimes as industrial accident, their next option would be eliminating the witnesses who could testify about deliberate sabotage. The contamination was affecting my ability to think clearly, but I could still hear their radio coordination. Footsteps approaching through the contaminated corridors. Professional movement patterns from people who'd done this kind of work before. I triggered the emergency evacuation override sequence, a final switch that would unlock all facility doors and activate external distress beacons. Federal response teams would have immediate access instead of having to breach secured entrances. Whatever happened to me, the evidence of corporate murder would reach the outside world. The facility's lights changed from emergency red to evacuation white as the override took effect. Automated systems began broadcasting contamination warnings and evacuation instructions. Every door in the building unlocked simultaneously, creating multiple access points for rescue teams and elimination exit routes for anyone trying to escape justice. Through my failing vision, I could see Jake approaching with 2 other hazmat team members. Their equipment looked professional, but their movement patterns were tactical rather than safety-focused. They'd abandoned the pretense of emergency response and revealed themselves as corporate enforcement. "Mr. Maddox," Jake's voice carried false professionalism. "You've created some problems for us." The electrical isolation was unexpected. I couldn't form words clearly anymore. The contamination had affected my vocal cords, and each breath felt like drowning in chemical acid. But I could still understand what was happening, still process the tactical situation. They needed information about the isolation procedures, about what evidence I'd discovered, about what I'd communicated to Orion, Priya, and Nyx. They couldn't simply execute me. They needed intelligence before elimination. "The illegal dumping operation," Jake continued, kneeling next to where I'd collapsed near the electrical panel. "How much do your colleagues know about the storage locations? What evidence have you gathered?" I managed to point toward the maintenance tablet I'd been carrying. "Let them think the evidence was contained in electronic files they could destroy. Let them focus on digital information while physical contamination samples and facility records remain secure in other locations." Jake retrieved the tablet, scrolling through maintenance logs and inspection records. "This shows routine maintenance only. Where are the contamination readings? Where are the storage location files?" The contamination was making it difficult to stay conscious, but I could still hear the facility's emergency systems broadcasting evacuation status updates. Federal response teams approaching facility perimeter. Estimated arrival in 12 minutes. 12 minutes. Jake and his team had 12 minutes to extract intelligence, eliminate witnesses, and escape before professional investigators arrived with contamination detection equipment and forensic capabilities. The storage areas in the Unused wing, Jake continued questioning. Your inspection records from last month. They show you accessed areas that were supposed to be permanently sealed. What did you find? I couldn't have answered clearly even if I'd wanted to. The chemical exposure had progressed beyond speech capability, beyond fine motor control, beyond most conscious cognitive function. But I could still hear everything, still understand the tactical situation, still recognize the approaching sounds of helicopter rotors and emergency vehicle engines. Federal response teams were arriving ahead of schedule. The facility's emergency override had provided them with immediate access information, contamination readings, and personnel status reports. They'd have contamination detection equipment, medical treatment capabilities, and most importantly, legal authority to investigate and arrest. Jake and his team realized their time was running out. Through my blurred vision, I could see them gathering evidence materials, preparing for rapid departure. They'd failed to eliminate the witnesses, failed to destroy the evidence, failed to complete their cover-up operation. But they could still escape. The facility's evacuation override had unlocked all doors, including service exits that led directly to external parking areas. If they moved quickly, they could be gone before federal investigators could establish perimeter security. I heard Orion's voice through the facility intercom. Federal response teams are entering the building. Medical personnel requested for basement level. Maddox needs immediate contamination treatment. They knew where I was. They were coming with medical equipment and legal authority. Jake's team had maybe 5 minutes before federal agents reached the basement level with questions they couldn't answer and equipment that would detect their presence. Move out, Jake ordered. Target is neutralized. Evidence collection complete. Exfiltration route echo. I could hear them retreating through the contaminated corridors, professional movement patterns covering their withdrawal from the basement level. They'd failed to complete their mission, but they'd escaped immediate capture. The contamination was causing everything to fade. Vision darkening, hearing becoming distant, consciousness slipping away despite my efforts to stay alert. But I could still hear the approaching sounds of rescue equipment, federal investigators, medical personnel trained in contamination treatment, footsteps in the corridor, professional voices coordinating emergency medical response. Equipment sounds that meant serious medical intervention, oxygen supply, intravenous treatment, cardiac monitoring. Contamination exposure victim located. Male, approximately 45 years old. Severe chemical poisoning. Beginning emergency treatment. Hands positioning breathing equipment. The blessed relief of clean oxygen replacing contaminated air. For insertion for chemical neutralization drugs. Cardiac monitoring to track organ damage progression. Vitals are weak but stable. Patient is responsive to stimulus. Transport preparation for immediate hospital evacuation. Through the medical equipment and emergency treatment, I could hear Orion providing status reports to federal investigators. 18 personnel rescued from Sector 11. All alive, moderate contamination exposure. For missing personnel still unaccounted for. Illegal storage areas confirmed in the unused wing. Evidence of deliberate sabotage to emergency response systems. The missing 4. In the confusion of emergency response and criminal investigation, 4 of our colleagues were still lost somewhere in the contaminated sections of the facility. The mathematical choices I'd made in the basement had saved 18 lives in Sector 11, eliminated the explosion threat, and provided evidence for federal prosecution, but 4 people were still missing. Search teams are deployed. Priya's voice joined the coordination. Contamination readings are improving throughout the facility. Atmospheric processing is functioning on isolated circuits. We have maybe 6 hours of battery power for continued operation. 6 hours for systematic search of contaminated areas. 6 hours for the missing personnel to survive on whatever clean air pockets they might have found. 6 hours for federal investigators to gather evidence about the illegal dumping operation and corporate conspiracy. Medical personnel were preparing me for transport, but I could still hear the facility's emergency systems providing status updates. Sector 11 evacuation complete. 18 personnel transported to hospital for contamination treatment. Search operations continuing in affected areas. The bitter mathematics of emergency response. 18 lives saved in Sector 11. For still missing and possibly dead. One maintenance supervisor with severe contamination exposure who might not survive the organ damage from chemical toxins. But Jake and his corporate team had failed. The illegal dumping operation was exposed. The evidence was secure. Federal investigators would trace the conspiracy back to its corporate origins and prosecute everyone involved in the cover-up and attempted mass murder. As medical personnel loaded me into transport equipment, I could see the facility I'd maintained for 23 years receding behind emergency vehicles and federal investigation equipment. The building looked different now, not like a workplace, but like a crime scene. The unused wing where illegal dumping had poisoned our air supply was sealed with hazmat tape, and the basement where I'd isolated the electrical systems was cordoned off for evidence collection. The helicopter transport lifted off, carrying me toward hospital treatment while search teams continued their systematic sweep for missing personnel. Through the medical equipment and oxygen supply, I could still hear radio communications coordinating the investigation. For missing personnel located in administrative wing. 2 deceased from contamination exposure. 2 alive but requiring immediate medical treatment. 2 more survivors. 20 people saved out of 26 total. The mathematics of emergency response measured in lives rather than percentages, in families who would see their loved ones again rather than those who wouldn't. But the corporate conspiracy had been exposed. The illegal dumping operation was documented. Jake and his team were subject to federal manhunt with evidence that would support prosecution for attempted mass murder, environmental crimes, and conspiracy charges. As consciousness faded under medical treatment and chemical neutralization drugs, I could still hear the helicopter's engines carrying me toward uncertain survival. Severe contamination exposure meant possible organ failure, permanent health damage, or death despite medical intervention. But the facility's personnel were safe. The evidence was preserved. The corporate murderers were exposed and fugitive rather than successful. 23 years of maintenance work had taught me that complex systems require constant attention, careful monitoring, and immediate response when problems develop. The human cost of corporate greed and environmental crime was just another system failure, but one that could be fixed with proper investigation, prosecution, and justice. Some saved, others lost, truth exposed at great personal cost. Victory measured not in heroic triumph, but in preventing worse tragedy and ensuring accountability for corporate crimes. The helicopter carried me toward uncertain recovery, while federal investigators secured evidence that would prevent future tragedies. The unused wing would be properly remediated. The illegal dumping would be prosecuted. The facility would be rebuilt with better safety protocols. And 20 people would go home to their families instead of dying from corporate murder disguised as industrial accident.